So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are here to present Conference Collaboration, an in-depth look into SCC Learning Services. My name is Camille Duncan, and I am a Learning Specialist and Academic Coordinator at the University of Missouri.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kelley Catenacci, and I'm the Director of Learning Services at the University of Florida.
Oops.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay. I am an Assistant Director of Athletic Academics at Mississippi State.
Howdy, my name is Michelle Stout. I'm the Assistant Athletic Director for Learning Services at Texas A&M University.
So today we are going to discuss how the SCC Learning Services Directors Meetings were formed and how these meetings sparked the inspiration to create the SCC Learning Services Guide. Additionally, we're going to take an in-depth look into our organizational structures at our programs. And at the end, we're going to partake in a panel discussion like we talked about. So again, put your Q&As in the chat and we will discuss those at the end.
So looking back a year ago, our profession was going through a major shift in how we support student athletes during this COVID pandemic. We were going from pretty much supporting students in person, face-to-face, to having to navigate virtual appointments, different technologies and platforms for the first time. There were budget constraints, hiring freezes. We were working from home remotely for the first time, and dealing with some challenges of technology. And so for me personally, I felt a little lost in that of if what I was doing was the right decisions for our program and for learning services. Was I supporting students in the best way? And so I started really looking for other professionals to share ideas with and get some validation that the approaches we were taking and the decisions we were making were correct and in the best interest of our students. And really just looking for some connection and support from other professionals. Within our conference, within the SCC, our academic directors had kind of an SCC group that they met regularly. Our student athlete development professionals had that, but our learning services area was kind of getting left out. We didn't have a group that was formalized and met regularly. So I kind of proposed that to the directors of the SCC and was really, really excited that they wanted to buy in and start this group. So we started meeting as a learning services SCC group. And so we currently have monthly
Grace. I
meetings.
forgot last night.
We meet the first Thursday of every month. And really the intent of that conversation is to share ideas, to bounce different topics and things off of each other, to learn about other institutions. I think that's been a real benefit of not only how things operate at A&M for me, but also the other institutions at the SCC. So it gives us some professional development as well, so we can continue to grow and learn as professional and student support staff members. And it really provided a sense of community, right? It gave us some people to lean on, a sense of support, and just a really cohesive group to learn from. And so I think there were a few reasons why this group, we really leaned on each other and it worked really well. Utilizing the conference as our kind of initiative provided some commonality and connection. It brought us all together, even though we compete on the playing fields. You know, we're all part of that same conference and on the same team in that sense. We were really intentional about the group size for our collaboration, and we focused on the leaders in the learning services unit. So not every school has a director of learning services role, but some schools have a lead learning specialist or people that kind of make those decisions for their department. And so we kept it small, we kept it intimate so that we could really have those close connections and some similar goals and initiatives in the roles that we sat in at each of our institutions, and just overall what we were trying to achieve every day as learning services professionals.
So from these meetings, like Michelle said, an abundance of knowledge was shared within our departments. And what sparked my attention was how we are able to all give such high quality service to our student athletes, but yet it looks entirely different at each institution. And I just think that that is really interesting. So we created the SEC resource guide. So what this is a 30+ page document that explains how each learning services department is organized. And so just starting out, we decided to focus on these 9 main areas, knowing that there's always going to be room to expand. So for each SEC institution, it explains what their organizational chart is, the 5 main learning specialist responsibilities, caseload determination, caseload sizes, tier system, support staff for learning services, initial screening process for incoming student athletes, diagnostic testing process and procedure, and relationship with Disability Center, and of course, room to expand. The nice thing about this document is it's always going to be in draft form. We always know that things are always going to be changing within our institutions, and so this is always going to be a working document. And I hope a takeaway for everyone is that this document can be replicated. I think it's really beneficial. And so I encourage you to maybe talk within your conferences and maybe make a document that's very similar, or at least be able to maybe take some information from how our institutions are organized and just learn something from that. So with that, looking within our resource guide, these are our 5 most common learning specialist responsibilities. So the first one is developing and implementing comprehensive educational programming, specifically targeting those student athletes deemed most at risk, including those diagnosed with education impacting disabilities. The second one was providing instruction to a caseload of students. The third is being a liaison with the on-campus disability center at their institutions, coordinating educational testing, and providing direction to staff, partaking in trainings, and developing those working within learning services. So obviously these responsibilities aren't going to be the same, but these are just kind of the 5 main themes that we saw throughout our resource guide. And I do want to point out that we understand that the learning specialist role can vary depending on the conference, it can vary depending on the institution. And so with that, if you're at a place where you're looking to add a learning specialist, or you're looking to expand your program, this is a really good starting point to nail down maybe some responsibilities that that person may have. So this is a resource guide snapshot, so to speak. Of course, there is a ton of information within our guide. And so I wanted to kind of give you guys a look in to see how things are set up. So learning service directors, like Michelle said, not every SEC institution has one, but this kind of gives you a breakdown of who does. Some of these learning service directors do meet with a caseload of students, while others do not. So technically the number of learning specialists can increase if that learning service director does meet with a caseload. The number of learning specialists within the SEC can vary between 1 to 9 learning specialists. In the hybrid category, I did not count in our data hybrids that had administrative responsibilities. So if these institutions have a check mark for a hybrid, that means that they share a role either with like a tutor coordinator, a reading specialist, or an academic coordinator or counselor. And then some institutions, of course, have more than one hybrid. Another thing that was interesting was the caseload determination. And so at 3 of our institutions at the SEC, caseload determination is by sport. At others, it is by the director. And then at Auburn and Vanderbilt, since they have 1 learning specialist, this isn't applicable to them. But I do want to point out for LSU, we do not have any information for them currently because they're in a restructuring process. The last is the tier system. And so I wanted to show you guys that some of our institutions do separate students by tiers, and they vary from 2 to 4 tiers. Some other data that was interesting is the SEC caseload size per learning specialist. Obviously, Missouri is hitting it out of the park on this one, and I can definitely tell you why that is. So at Mizzou, a student stays on a learning specialist caseload throughout their entire career, whether they use services or not. So we will always have, a student will always have a person there to support them. And so that definitely fluctuates our numbers, as well as Missouri is also going to be adding a new learning specialist. So be on the lookout for that. And we understand that our caseload numbers are high, and so we are adding a learning specialist to decrease those numbers. Without Missouri, though, the average caseload size for the SEC is 8 to 15 students.
All right, so Camille was able to give us a great overview of the SEC as a whole. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to take a deeper dive into the structure of 4 different SEC learning services programs to demonstrate both the similarities and the differences amongst our organizational structures and create key program policies. So I will go ahead and kick us off with the University of Florida. At UF, I fulfill the role of Director of Learning Services, and I'm also joined by 3 full-time learning specialists. Each of us has a caseload of around 7 to 9 students. It does fluctuate a little bit depending on the semester, but that's pretty typical. And we work with these students. They are from a variety of sports, so we are not sport specific. In addition to our student caseloads, each of the learning specialists, including the director, also has an administrative area of the program that they are responsible for. So the director's area of oversight, my area of oversight, is the recruiting, hiring, training, and supervision of both the full-time learning specialists as well as our part-time strategy tutors. Learning Specialist 1's area of oversight is the psychoeducational testing process, as well as the academic screening of all of our student athletes. Learning Specialist 2 is responsible for the oversight of our Assistant Learning Specialist program. And then Learning Specialist 3's area of oversight is the recruiting, hiring, and training of all of our remedial tutors. Currently, we have 2 assistant learning specialist interns, but we have just hired 2 more, so we're very excited to be expanding that structure. All 4 of them are pursuing a master's degree at the University of Florida while they're in this position. And so we have them in 2 cohorts. Each year, there are 2 who are in the 2nd year of their program with us and in the 2nd year of their master's, and then 2 who are in their 1st year of the program. These interns do work 40 hours a week, and they have caseloads that are relatively comparable to that of a learning specialist caseload. We have a 2-year professional development curriculum that these assistant learning specialists go through. And so bi-weekly, they have a professional development lesson. Topics include things like examining unconscious bias, models of disability, tutoring, supervision, networking, mock interviews, things along those nature. And then on the opposing weeks, they have supervision with the learning specialist who supervises them. So they're able to go over their semester goals, their weekly goals, reflect on the previous 2 weeks, and talk about any sort of challenges or initiatives that they would like to implement. In terms of determining the service within our program, how do we figure out who goes on what caseload, who's going to work with who? The way it works is advisors at University of Florida are given a list of students who are eligible for receiving learning services. So we know that from previous semesters, or if they're a new student, they're an incoming student, we are examining their admissions information as well as their academic screeners that we are giving them before they even start school with us. And we're able to determine whether or not we think that they would require the services of the learning services program, and we'll let the advisors know. And then from there, the advisors can request the frequency of sessions as well as the level of service provision. And then the learning services staff, led by myself, we decide how those requests are going to be fulfilled. So as much as possible, we try to kind of work with the advisors on what they are requesting, but ultimately we do have kind of autonomy and the final decision on what those tutor-student matches are, as well as the scheduling. So that something special to note, all of the students who work with the learning specialists, assistant learning specialists, and most of our strategy tutors are diagnosed with a learning disability, ADHD, a mental health concern, or some other type of education impacting disorder. We do have a couple of special circumstances, but that is primarily who we're working with, the most at-risk student athletes. And then we do have other areas of the learning services program that are able to provide service to the student athletes who are undiagnosed but still benefit from the services. So that's just a quick snapshot of Florida.
Here at Mississippi State, we have 4 full-time positions, as well as 1 to 2 graduate assistant positions that encompass our learning service unit. So the first one is the Assistant Director of Athletic Academics. That's my role. And I primarily oversee learning services. I also am a counselor and learning specialist for football. I coordinate all of the testing that is here at Mississippi State. I also am in charge of coordinating the risk assessment and roster system that we have that helps determine our placement of where our students are. And then I also determine the caseload of our learning specialists. So we have 2 full-time learning specialist positions. So learning specialist 1, she has a caseload that is sports specific to football, women's basketball, and baseball. She also coordinates our mentor program. Mentors for us are, comparable and comparable to assistant learning specialists or, just part-time employees that help our next level risk student athletes. We deem them as our yellow students, and I'll go into that a little bit. She also is our co-coordinator for bridge and workshops. Our learning specialist number 2 is also assigned a specific caseload, sports specific. So football, men's basketball, and softball. She also coordinates the proctor program that we have here. Proctors for us are just student workers that help us maintain the integrity of academic sessions throughout our building. So they're placed all throughout our building to help with that. And then she coordinates our screening process and is also the co-coordinator for bridge and workshops. And then lastly, for our full-time role is our tutoring coordinator and assistant learning specialist. So she has a caseload of sports-specific students, men and women's track, and then she coordinates all the content tutorial programming for all of our student athletes. So those are kind of organization chart as well as kind of each of our roles. And then in terms of caseload sizes, we base it around more so number of hours than we do number of students, but I'll kind of give a range for both of those. So for the assistant director role, my role, I meet with 5 to 8 students, which translates to about 15 to 20 hours per week for student meetings on a learning specialist component. For each of our learning specialists, they meet with 8 to 10 students, which translates to be about 25 to 30 hours of student meetings. Our tutorial coordinator assistant learning specialist, she meets with 2 to 3 students, which varies from 3 to 6 hours. And then our graduate assistant or assistants meet with 4 to 5 students, roughly translating to 10 to 12 hours per week for student meetings. So all of these positions, all of these hours allocate obviously time for the administrative responsibilities that I mentioned earlier. And then our tiered system, kind of what I mentioned with the mentors with our yellow students. So we have a red, yellow, green system, and that has been determined from an adapted grow model. And we have both a incoming risk assessment as well as a returner risk assessment. So we evaluate our students every single summer, so including the returners. So we'll evaluate them at the end of each academic year, at the beginning of the new academic year. And so based on that data is how they're then determined to be a red, yellow, or green. And so if they score a 10 or higher if on the incoming risk assessment, or a 9 or higher on the returner risk assessment, the counselor is allowed the opportunity to have them on a learning specialist or a learning service graduate assistant caseload. If the student scores a 6 to 9 on the incoming or a 6 to 8 on the returner risk assessment, the counselor has the opportunity of putting them on a mentor caseload, and that's yellow. And then the green section, if the incoming student scores a 5 or below, or on the returner risk assessment is a 5 or below, then that student is going to primarily work with a counselor or a counselor graduate assistant. Obviously, all 3 of these levels, red, yellow, green, are allowed any content tutoring that the counselor deems appropriate. So.
All right. So at the University of Missouri, our program is called Mizzou Made Academics, but our learning services department is the Enhanced Learning Program. So I'll be saying ELP because that's what our title is. But our Associate AD of Academic Services oversees all of our full-time staff. So we do not have a learning services director. But she is in charge of our educational testing. So she's our point person for that. We have 4 learning specialists, and 3 of those are hybrid with 1 full-time learning specialist without any other responsibilities. Our caseload determination is by sport, and I listed the sports below, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But in order to be a part of ELP, the student athlete has to have a documented learning disability or be deemed high risk. And we do have 3 tiers of student athletes. So tier 1 is our most at risk, and so those are our emerging learners. Tier 2 is our independent learners, so they don't need maybe as much assistance. And then our tier 3 are flourishing learners. And so they are independent, they have flown the nest, and we are here if they need support. So looking within our structure, the full-time learning specialist has baseball, wrestling, softball, swim and dive, women's soccer, and women's basketball. That is a lot of student athletes, so that is why caseload sizes are very high. But with our new addition of a new learning specialist, that will decrease her caseload size that she currently has. My position is a learning specialist for football offense and volleyball, as well as being the academic coordinator for volleyball. So 80% of my job goes to the learning specialist, 20% of my job is academic coordinator. The next hybrid is a learning specialist for football defense and men's basketball, as well as the academic coordinator for men's basketball. So again, she's 80-20 as well. And then our last hybrid is the tutor mentor coordinator and also learning specialist for track and field, gymnastics, and tennis. And so it's an 80-20 split for her as well, just the other way. We have usually 6 to 10 assistant learning specialists working within our program, where we have our own individual meetings and professional development within our own ELP group. The assistant learning specialists are either professionals that are really interested in the field, or we have a lot of retired school teachers or people from education, and they still would love to work, and so they love working with our students. And so we are usually blessed to have a lot of wonderful help. Graduate assistants, depending on the year, we could have 1 graduate assistant working within ELP to 3 graduate assistants working within ELP. It just really depends, but they act as assistant learning specialists as well as having other administrative responsibilities. But the 4 of us split a lot of the administrative responsibilities that maybe a learning services director would do by himself or herself. And so we meet every week or every 2 weeks as the 4, and we just discuss what are the things that we need to be doing and splitting those things up. In terms of our screening process for incoming student athletes, we look at the recruit report. So like, what's the ACT, SAT, what high school did they go to? Because that can be very telling. We send out an incoming educational survey that's filled out by a parent or guardian. It's through Qualtrics, and so we use that information to see if they're coming in with any documentation already, so we can be proactive and go ahead and get that. We also have a wellness assessment that all student athletes do when they come to campus, as well as get a riding sample from the summer bridge program that we have. So that is just a quick look at ELP.
Okay. At Texas A&M, I serve in that assistant AD for learning services role. And I am in more of a true director position. So most of my job is the supervising of staff, whether that's full-time or our part-time staff members, as well as just the administrative parts of our program. So I do have a caseload of 2 students, which is pretty small. So I love that I still get that touch point. But I have a much smaller caseload than the rest of our learning specialist staff. So our organizational chart is kind of split up into 2 areas. The left-hand side of the org chart is really our content area specialist. So we do have an assistant director of learning services who is a reading specialist and our tutor coordinator. And she is the only hybrid role that we have within learning services. So she oversees all of our content tutors. We typically have 50 to 75 content tutors at any given time. They are undergraduate students that are kind of experts in specific subject areas. And she also is a reading specialist. So we're unique in that we have some reading and math specialists that's kind of their area of expertise and what they focus on. So they are really in charge of overseeing the Texas Success Initiative, or TSI. And that is a program mandated by the state of Texas for students remedial in reading, writing, and math. And so the requirements is pretty rigorous. And so we have a group of full-time professionals that oversee student completion of those subject areas. So we do have one full-time reading specialist who works specifically with students that are remedial in reading and writing. That reading specialist also has a program for our international students to help them with English language proficiency, whether that's reading, writing, or speaking. So we do have a point person specifically to support our international students as well. We have a full-time math specialist, and so she does math all day, every day. That is pretty much her role on a daily capacity. And then we also have just 3 learning services assistants, which are student workers that really help with some of the admin tasks for our program, and they are overseen by that assistant director of learning services. Going over to the right-hand side of the org chart, we do have another assistant director of learning services. She works as a learning specialist, has a full caseload of anywhere between 12 and 14 students that she works with. So that's her primary role. But in that assistant director position, she also oversees our training, professional development, continued education workshops for our academic mentors and our tutors as well. So she does a lot of our training and professional development and mentor appreciation. We have 2 learning specialists that are pretty much strictly learning specialists. They spend most of their time working with students and their caseload. And we also have 3 assistant learning specialists. And they right now are sports specific. So we have one that works with women's basketball, one that's men's basketball, and one that works strictly with football. They are the only positions within learning services currently that are sports specific. Everything else is kind of a mix of sports and based on student need. So our caseload determination, we have a tiered system. Learning specialists are the highest level of support. So they are getting the students that have diagnosed learning disabilities, maybe behavioral concerns, eligibility issues, who we deem the most at risk. Our assistant learning specialists kind of take on that next tier that don't meet on a learning specialist caseload, but still providing a high level support. And then within our academic mentor program, we have two different categories of support there. So we have an academic mentor appointments, which is really hands-on, one-on-one, assisting those student athletes in time management, organization, study skills, all those pieces for them to build the skills they need to be academically successful. And then we also have a check-in program. And so those are for students that are a little bit more independent, that maybe kind of working themselves out of our program. And so those are typically a little bit shorter sessions. Some of them may be group sessions. And so it's a little bit of a lighter level of support. So that's kind of a quick snapshot of how we're structured at Texas A&M.
All right, so we are going to do kind of a quick guided panel discussion, and then as we promised, we will definitely take the time for some audience questions as well. But we picked out a couple questions that we knew were going to be really important to discuss and share from each of our perspective. So the first question is, where do each of us see the future of learning services? My response to that, one thing that I think is going to change and continue on into the future is the integration of virtual formats, digital components post-COVID. So examples include tutor onboarding and training and continuing education, orientation type meetings, things like that, which can be really flexible for our part-time staff to have that type of method of instruction and presentation. And then also the virtual format for student athletes. Some of them have thrived in the virtual environment, and I think it's really taught us that on the road, when they're gone for competition or training or something like that, they can still engage in their academics as opposed to having to cancel appointments or rearrange them. We now have a little bit more flexibility in that area. And then one more thing I'll mention that I see really being kind of a large part of the future of learning services is more emphasis being placed on both diversity and intersectionality within learning services programs. So I think there's a conscious effort not only to recruit more diverse tutors and learning specialists, but also to hire them and then retain them as members of our staffs and to see them into leadership positions. Additionally, I think providing students with a lens within which to view their identity, intersecting between their sport, their race, their gender identity, their disability, and more. And our academic centers can become a safe space for them to express their unique combination of each of these identities. Michelle, where do you see the future of learning services?
So one thing that I think is really exciting about the future of learning services is just the development of the different roles and positions and hierarchy that's been created in the last few years. I think as you saw at our 4 institutions, right, there's lots of different roles. We have directors and those kinds of things. I know when I first started in the profession, it was pretty much you're a learning specialist, that's all you'll ever be. And there really wasn't a whole lot of room for professional growth and development in the learning services avenue, that you kind of had to move over to that academic advising side if you wanted a bigger title or a promotion or just more responsibility. And so that's one thing that I'm super excited about the future of learning services, is seeing more directors of learning services, more assistant directors, and really creating opportunities within learning services for professionals to develop and to grow and to take on more responsibility.
So another question that we thought was important, of course, was how has COVID impacted learning services and how has it positively enhanced our programs? So I know all of us, basically a year ago, we had a huge barrier, right? At Mizzou, 1 week, we were in person, everything was normal. And the next week, bam, we're all at home, everything's on Zoom, and we're trying to still give that same high quality level of service to our student athletes in an entirely new environment. A lot of our student athletes had gone home, and I think one of the biggest barriers that we had was just the lack of resources that student athletes had. And a lot of student athletes maybe didn't have internet or reliable internet, or they didn't have a computer or a laptop or a quiet work environment being at home. And so it was a real challenge to be able to try to still meet with them and serve them, and for them to be able to continue to do their schoolwork with the expectations that campus still had, which then in turn kind of creates an equity issue, right? Like, if it's not fair to expect that everyone's going to have the same level of resources, but campus is still wanting everything to be the same. And so there was a lot of give and take and new ideas that we had to come up with and to make sure that we were supporting everyone the best way that we could. But with that, there's opportunities. So like this right now, we're able to collaborate and meet and discuss with people that we wouldn't be able to do like in the past. And like Kelley said on the last question, now we do have virtual learning and we do have online sources that we can use because it can work. And I think that that's also a great opportunity in the future to be able to do trainings and do Zoom tutoring, especially if you have student athletes on the road. But Lindsay, what's your take on this?
Yeah, definitely COVID has presented all of us a lot of challenges, but with challenges, there's, we keep using the word opportunity, and excitement for advances and everything. So for us, I would say definitely we took a pause with when COVID happened. And so obviously March timeframe, Mississippi State, we wanted to pause and have the best policies and procedures in place for virtual sessions. So we paused with tutoring, and fortunately our campus had continued tutoring services. So we partnered with them and still provided obviously exceptional support for our student athletes, but collaboration with different institutions and figuring out what different policies and procedures needed to be in place for virtual sessions. We had always wanted to explore the realm of virtual sessions for the future, and COVID just kind of made that happen a little bit sooner for us, which was still wonderful. So we feel really confident and in our policies and procedures with how we have virtual sessions that, when we talk about the future, we will continue those sessions, whether that is for travel, competition, whether that's for extenuating circumstances, injuries, knock on wood, no one gets them. But just anything like that, we're looking towards the future and making sure that we have all of those necessary things in place. Also, when students thrive in this area of a virtual setting, being able to offer obviously those services as well too. So it doesn't necessarily have to be deemed towards travel or extenuating circumstances or anything like that. I would also say that COVID, kind of like Camille mentioned, getting really creative with resources. So I feel like all of us on the call, we're educators. We want to be able to provide the best possible services for our student athletes. And so using whiteboard features, using videos, just different resources that, maybe in person was not something that we naturally thought of, but in this type of setting in virtual services, we had to get a little creative with that. So I would say that those are definitely two other ways that COVID has positively impacted our learning service units. So our third question, what are the challenges within learning services? What are some potential avenues for change? So kind of like Michelle mentioned earlier, the job description and the hierarchy aspect of learning service units are still being explored, are still being navigated. And I think it's going to be really important that, the descriptions of those, how each institution, how each athletic department wants to see that structured, starts with directors and really navigating what does that need to look like for each respective unit. And obviously you guys have seen that we are 4 very different structured units, along with all the SEC, from what Camille presented out earlier. So it's really making sure that, the job descriptions are there, and, what are the expectations for all of those roles. But knowing that, there are opportunities for growth in learning services at different institutions and where that might lead. So there's definitely opportunities for full-time oversight, for oversight of support staff members. So it's not necessarily always working with students, but I feel like that's probably where we feel some of the most reward in our job and everything. But just definitely definitely making sure that the descriptions and the expectations are there in order for the necessary learning specialists and tutorial coordinators and all the different positions that can fall within learning services are met. I would also say that kind of the burnout and turnover rate within learning services, that is definitely a concern and something that, I think more than ever, we are paying attention to, especially since COVID has happened. We've all been tried, and, we've been, zoomed out for a while and everything. So I think to be able to know that you have resources in others, I think, Michelle hit that on the head for just us as a whole SEC director learning service unit, being able to talk to one another, and it's outside of our specific institution, being able to know that we are doing all the right things, we are on the same page as everyone else, that you'll feel less of a burnout, or less of wanting to get out of the industry. So definitely reaching out to other entities and other individuals that are within learning services, and then lastly, kind of taking the time for yourself. We can only be our best selves when we are taking a day off here and there, taking the time to make sure that we're good, so then we can support our student athletes, our staff, and everything like that. So Michelle, what would you say is kind of some areas for you?
Yeah, I think one challenge in learning services is always being able to support every single student athlete at our institution, no matter what their ability level, their background, what type of support that they need. And so I think COVID showed us that sometimes we have to be really creative and stretch resources and prioritize students sometimes, which can be really challenging to make some of those decisions and to be creative. I think looking ahead, some future challenges as eligibility clock extensions have happened. We've had different transfer rules. I see learning services needing to support a larger number of students as roster sizes grow over the next couple years. Because of that, we'll see more students that are pursuing graduate degrees, and students that are looking for continued education opportunities so that they can stay and play their sport. And so it's going to be a different type of support, a different level of support for some of those students than I think we've experienced in the past. And so I think that's a coming challenge that we're going to see more of kind of in the future. And I think continuing to work with other professionals in the field, lean on this group within the SEC to see how to best put that, what are going to be the new model practices and best practices for us to implement within learning services for those students. So tying it back into that SEC Learning Services Directors meeting, we really wanted to kind of talk about the impact of that. So obviously this meeting has pulled together the presenters on this call. It's given us some opportunities to connect in that sense of community. I think for me, it really provided a safe space for me to ask questions and to learn new things. And some days it was a time to commiserate and vent and realize we're all in this together and we're all experiencing the same things. And that was sometimes more beneficial than any of the really applicable practical things that we discussed in those meetings. But really it provides a sense of encouragement and motivation. Just from other professionals in the field. I know I typically leave those meetings feeling really re-energized and inspired and kind of ready to take on the day. And so those are some benefits that I've seen from this group, and hopefully, at your conferences or even other groups, that those would be something that you could seek out and see the benefits as well. So Kelley, what's the impact been for you?
Yeah, I can't tell you, this is going to sound a little bit silly, but to pose a question and to hear that no one else in the group had an answer either, that was really encouraging, as kind of counterproductive as that seems, but it just helped us realize that, like, okay, we are doing the best that we can, and there is not a magic solution. Like, we're not missing anything. And then we were able to kind of transition it into kind of constructive brainstorming and that type of thing. But I kept calling my experience in the SEC directors meeting kind of like productive validation. Like, I was able to get validation not only for what we were trying and the things that we were attempting to do as a program, but I also, any sort of like ideas or things that I heard in the meeting that other institutions were doing that I thought would be great to bring back to our program to try out or to adapt. I was able to kind of, again, like I said, have that validation or the reason why. So when I'm presenting it to my director and saying, here, I think we should do this, and the reason is because it's been tested out by some other institutions that are similar to us, and they've had this experience, and I think it would work this way in our program. So it was really nice to kind of have that support behind the decisions that we were kind of taking out of those meetings as well. And then I can't echo Michelle enough, just having that space with other people who know exactly what you are going through. And again, a lot of times it was very much like, my student said this to me, can you believe it? Or, complaining. And it really does serve a function, especially when Lindsay spoke about the burnout potential in this field and how we're all really tired sometimes and frustrated and at our wits' end. To have that social support from other people who are your peers is incredibly beneficial. And again, I would echo Michelle and encourage other conferences or regions to consider constructing a group like this, because it's been incredible. All right. Well, Keenan, if you're still here with us, do we have any questions in the chat from the audience? And if you all have any questions, please go ahead and continue to put those in there.
Yes, I am indeed still here. Great presentation. So we did not have any questions come through in the chat. And so what we were going to do, just use the raise your hand feature. Actually, here we go. They're rolling in. All right. First question for you ladies, advice, this is from Jessica. Advice for those, based on what you have learned creating these units in SEC who are at smaller institutions looking to transition into a LS role, or even creating that role at their current institution. I believe that was just for the group.
I can go ahead and get us started here. So I think I've learned a lot in just the creation and being a part of the SEC and learning services units. I think any advice that I have for someone just wanting to transition into a learning specialist role, whether it's at a small school, a big school, I think continuing to learn just what is the role of a learning specialist and what that looks like, because it does vary greatly as you learn just within the SEC. It looks very different. So across the country, it varies even more. So I think some of those core principles, like we talked about, those 5 themes that we saw within learning services of trying to seek out information, whether that's podcasts, conferences, webinars, books, of like really educating yourself on those areas to make yourself marketable as you're applying for jobs and trying to make that transition. And then building that network. Like we talked about today, I think the collaboration has been huge for us professionally. And so seeking out other people that are learning specialists or work within the learning services field and having conversations with them, learning from their experiences and kind of taking that for yourself.
I'll also add to that question, especially the kind of the second part that says, even creating that role at their current institution. I am a little bit of a nerd and I love when job descriptions come through the listserv and I actually copy and paste all of the job descriptions into, and I have a running total. So, and that's just obviously a conversation that you have with your director and what their goals of their unit and their structure looks like. So definitely, taking that information and being very purposeful with how you could present what that could potentially look like. At Mississippi State, we actually transitioned one role into then a second learning specialist role. And so, getting with our director on what that needed to look like and, making sure that all the job responsibilities across all of our full-time, had purpose and intent and everything. So definitely I would encourage always keeping kind of a running list of those job descriptions and the roles and opportunities in that regard.
Great. So we have about 5 minutes and we have 3 questions in the chat. So the first one is from Wendy. For those that have hybrid roles, what do you see as pros or cons of being both an advisor and a learning specialist for a team?
I can go for this one too, since I am both a counselor and learning specialist, as well as oversight for our learning service unit. There are great days and there are some challenging days to balance all of that. So for me, for a pro, I love being able to kind of see the semester goal as well as the prolonged goal of helping students with degree plans. And so for me, I get fulfillment as being both a student's counselor / advisor and their learning specialist, because I have the entire vision for that. That's not to say that can't be achieved without being a counselor. It's just definitely more communication heavy with the learning specialist and advisor for that specific student, and having that voice and having that open dialogue of what that can look like. But for me personally, that's a huge pro of why I love what I do. Cons, in terms of time I have to get really, really creative with at times. And so I know that there are some times that I completely miss the boat and have to, spend maybe extra time with students because the plan that I initially set out for that day wasn't achieved, because then my counselor role, advisor role had to come into play as well too during that time. So time is definitely can be at times very con for that.
Sorry. Then our next question is from Dom. What were some challenges in creating new positions within your learning services structure? How did you get department buy-in?
I can speak on that one. So in 2017, ELP went from having 1 person to now we're in 2021 and we have 4 people. So we have definitely grown and expanded. Now we're about to add another person. Of course, there's always going to be challenges within growing the structure and reorganizing, but having other people to be able to bounce ideas off of and using that collaboration within your own department or with other institutions, I think is really important. But in order to get department buy-in, it sounds bad, but like numbers talk. The more info and data that you can collect on what other institutions are doing, or maybe looking at like how many hours you have to support student athletes in terms of like hours, and then also looking at about how many hours are needed. So like making a pie chart. These are how many hours that we can support for student athletes. However, looking at risk assessments or looking at these, like we need a lot more hours to be able to support the needs of our students. So I know that in our field, it's really hard to show data because a lot of what we do is qualitative and not quantitative. But when you can use that quantitative data, I think it's really helpful to be able to have some more buy-in.
And I'll just quickly add on to what Camille was talking about, recognizing the number of hours needed and then how to provide those hours. Again, numbers do talk, especially when you're looking up the ladder at the senior associate ADs and things like that. So if you're able to establish kind of like creating this new position is actually financially a responsible decision for us. It's more cost effective than perhaps hourly or part-time staff because we're paying them at X rate, whereas a full-time person will be able to take on student support as well as potentially some other items in this office. Again, we learning services professionals might be more inclined to think of it in terms of kind of like the academic progress of the student. But again, those other individuals in our programs that we need to get buy-in from, like Camille said, numbers talk. And so the financial aspect is also a really important thing to be able to speak to.
Awesome. And then the last question before I put up the QR code for a session evaluation is from Brittany. For those of us that may not be Power 5 and have less resources, financial, staff numbers, etc., what do you suggest we focus on from those 5 job duties of an LS? Income and student testing, relationship with the Disability Center, training others such as tutors or mentors to help the students like we do?
One thing I'll plug is academic screening. I know there's a wide variety. And again, I'm so thankful for the SEC resource guide because we've gotten a snapshot of how all the schools in the SEC do it and they do it differently. But by and large, academic screening can be free or incredibly low cost. And so I think institutions at any level will be able to facilitate that. And then even if you and your programs are not able to turn around and support every single student athlete that comes out with risk indicators from those academic screeners, you'll at least have identified them and be able to, refer them to campus resources or other things like that. So I think that's important.
Yeah, I'll just add anything where you can be proactive and not spend a lot of time or money on is going to be highly valuable. So like being a liaison with the Disability Center doesn't take that much additional time. Set up a meeting with someone on campus. Maybe you can create a point person that you work within athletics. So if student athletes do have documentation, you have one person you're going to. Anything that you can do to like make things efficient in our field is really important. So being proactive with those screenings, having a point person within disability services, and anything that you can do within tutor training that's low cost, I think is really beneficial. But thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And if you want to get in contact with us, we do have contact information as well on the end of our presentation. And then I encourage you guys to also fill out the survey as well. But thank you all.
If you all have any issues with the QR code, please let me know. Once you have that, you're free to end the session and get ready for your next one. Thank you again, ladies. Great presentation.
Thank you. Oh, they're wanting contact information.
I can share my screen again really quick if that's okay, Keenan. There we go.